Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Balaji Ranganathan, and I'm serving with the Department of English at the KSKV Kutch University. And the topic I'm going to talk on today is from structuralism to postmodernism, constructions of meanings and their radical uncertainty. My basic outline of what I'm going to speak on today is I'm going to give you a brief overview on structuralism, the post-structuralist views of language and reality, power and discourse, modernism, and postmodernism. Now, when we're talking about the keywords for structuralist and semiotic approaches, we follow language as a model. And looking at language as a model, we look at language as a system of meanings consisting of a few basic elements like binaries. We're talking about roles, my themes, narrators, and narratees. And this follows a lot of what Roland Barthes was speaking in his introduction to semiotics when he was talking about the formation of the text and how the text itself consists of tensions and problems within the binary notions of language. Some of the key concepts when it comes to semiotics is that culture is composed of different languages and different systems of science. Within cultures, you have major structures like myths, which are constructed by emptying out or distorting the signs and the original meanings. In the sense, myths are very seductive and they tend to change from time to time. And they change from culture to culture and from place to place. When we're talking about post-structuralism, we find that it's a major theoretical school which appeared in the postmodern age, which radicalized structuralist views of language by seeing the signified as signifiers and separating signs from reality. A major problem with post-structuralism, which other theoretical schools such as Marxism, feminism, and post-colonialism are looking at, is that they have a conflict with the slippery notion of this entire discipline, in the sense they find that it's not localized enough into materiality, and it's the Marxists and the feminist views which talk about the basic problems that are inherent within post-structuralism. But we do find that its influences range from arts to popular culture, and today, looking at society within postmodernism, we do find that post-structuralism has been largely responsible for the development and the construction of society and the isms. Now, there are a few major questions when it comes to post-structuralism in terms of theory. How does post-structuralism decenter traditional authorities? A few questions like what Barthes had asked Roland Barthes in one of his essays called The Death of an Author. Why is the author dead? Why is there nothing outside the text? Why is reality textual and the individual a product of social and linguistic forces? You could term it as a tissue of textualities. Why is the signifier floating, in the sense, in the process of dissemination and the construction of the text? There's an endless free play of meanings. The notion of decentering and the problem of a decentered text, which is central to post-structuralism and which, in a way, undermines traditional authorities, can best be seen in the way the centers of foundations, the traditional centers of foundations in our lives, for example, truth, humanity, family, nation, history, reality, God, and creativity, even a notion like the author. Now, these have stable meanings. Stable meanings in the sense we normally posit them in the center. And all discourses are constructed around the center. For example, truth and society, humanity and relations, family and character, the building up of the basic psyche, the nation and the construction of the nation in terms of its pluralities, history and its pluralities. These are the centers of foundations. Along with this, you can have what would be termed as a physical analogy, which would mean For example, the ground beneath our feet, which is a fixed landmark. We feel a degree of stability, and we are able to measure other things with this. The moment we look at the two basic ideas, the centers of foundation, physical and the physical analogy, and we try and examine that through the notion of language, then everything gets destabilized. It gets destabilized mainly because language itself faces moments of erasure, moments of rupture, and moments where it's very, very difficult for language to actually remain stable. When we talk about reality as textual and an individual, we could term it as a product of social and linguistic forces, then how do we look at subject positions? In the sense, I'm trying to examine why would an author be dead? Like what Barth had mentioned, the author is dead. Our social existence is largely modeled after language as a system of relations. In the sense, you have what could be termed as the kinship rituals. It could be termed as gender, and kinship rituals involve varied subject positions. It could be ranging from the father to the mother to grandparents, sister-in-laws, brother-in-laws, and so on. But all in all, what we do find is there is a degree, a symbolic reference attached to it. Different languages would provide us with different subject positions in that sense, and there could be a moment where the author might not be aware of it. A process what we could term as a polysemy. So we are talking about how a text would function, because it's largely the text which in a way destabilizes the entire notion of an author's stability. So when we talk about a concept from a work to a text, and if I use Barth's comment, there's nothing outside of text, we need to understand a few concepts here. In the sense, how do we define a work and how do we define a text? A work would be something that would be very physical. There could be books on a library shelf. But a text is something that cannot be contained. A text is something that cannot rest on a shelf. A text is a methodology that moves. It cuts across time. It cuts across chronos. And it moves across topos. The text is hugely independent. There might be many works where there are no texts. So when you talk about a text, that's a new system, that's a new way of reading literature today. In the sense, in the age of postmodernism, there are no fixed boundaries and no stable meanings. Example, the internet and the world of ads, where there's this constant slippage. There are web pages that appear and web pages that disappear, and ads that appear and ads that disappear, ads that don't convey meaning at all, in the sense that we look for. So when we talk about the death of the author, we are also talking about the birth of a reader. In the sense, as a reader, we construct texts, and in the process of a reader constructing the text, the author passes away, figuratively or symbolically. You can look at it that way. But when you're talking about reading meaning and reality within the text, there are a few points that we need to look at. One would be deconstruction, to read against the grain and to find textual undecidability. How does one read against the grain? This is something I'm going to talk about. At the same time, we're also going to talk about a postmodern self-reflexivity, where everything is a representation and it needs an interpretation. In the sense, postmodernism believes that everything that you see is a mediated representation. It needs to be interpreted. It needs to be disseminated. Now, coming down to the basic tenets of structuralism, I'm looking at a few ideas here. I'm trying to look at language and literature as an enclosed system. Now, I have a nominal graph here, a graph which talks about two scales, the x-axis and the y-axis. On one side, I have the syntagmatic combination or the syntagmatic scale on the x-axis, and I have the paradigmatic scale on the y-axis. So the syntagmatic scales would normally contain roles, actions, narrative structures, syntax, ideas like metonymy. But the paradigmatic scales would have something like thematic structures, motifs, my themes, metaphors, etc. If I can put it a bit more simpler, if I use the word white, the white would exist on the syntagmatic scale, but at the same time, the color has been contrasted with a large number of colors within the background. They could be red, they could be black, they could be violet, whatsoever. But the point is, they function as traces, invisible traces behind you. In the sense, language is constantly in a state of a comparative mode, and at times there are comparative crises. Everything that we speak refers back to something that's much larger. It exists, hangs, envelops you like a ghost. It's like an envelope. It's not seen, it's not visible, but at the same time, it refers back to the language that you're speaking. Now, why would language be ambiguous? Why are meanings undecidable and slippery? I'm using two concepts here: polysemy, multiple contexts, and multiple context. If I talk about polysemy, we're talking about traces of other signs, other meanings. In the sense, if I give you an example of something called a national birthday, then I have two different concepts and two different meanings attached to this. So, in terms of multiple contexts, we find that fixing meaning in terms like a national birthday would be slightly undecidable. For example, the end of the world. How do I fix meaning here? The end of what? The end of the world. And what does the world stand for? Is it a physical world? Is it a cultural world? What are we talking about? In the sense, meaning is not present. It happens to be in between what could be termed as signifiers. Now, this is something I'm going to explain ahead. Now, before I move on to what Jacques Derrida was talking about, we would like to know a bit about what Saussure was talking about in his lecture on general linguistics, where he outlined two ideas. He talked about the langue and the parole. And he talked about three other things in terms of the signifier, the signified, and the linguistic sign. Saussure, who was a 19th century linguist, in a way revolutionized linguistics. He talked about the langue which is the larger system of language, and he used a term called the parole, which is an individual utterance. In the sense, I'm basically uttering a series of paroles. And he talked about the signifier. A signifier is the phonetic equivalent of every word that we utter. In terms of phonetics, they are sounds. But the moment I say tree, on one hand, in terms of a signifier, they are words, they are sounds. But I'm using that sound with an underlying image of a tree, which, when it comes together, it causes this sign, the tree. We understand what a tree looks like. It has a trunk, it has branches, it has leaves. There's a universality in a drawing of a tree. Now, this is something in which Saussure privileges the vocal. Now, there is this huge argument in Western philosophy, which Derrida is going to talk about. I'm about to speak on Derrida now. The argument is speech has always been privileged over writing, be it Plato, be it Aristotle, come down to Levi-Strauss, or whoever we talk about. They always privilege speech, Shruti, in that sense. But Derrida, who is a post-structuralist philosopher, in a way brought out this entire notion of deconstruction. He's talking about a few things here. He's talking about the instability of meaning, writing as difference. He's giving you ideas of the center or the transcendental signified and binarism. And he's also talking, I'm also going to tell you a bit about deconstruction as a literary practice. Along with that, there are a few other concepts what Derrida outlined as a trace on arch writing. So when we talk about language in movement, and I'm talking about spacing, I'm talking about movement from one signifier to another. Now we understand, as I explained, a signifier, as Saussure talked about, is a vocal, a sound, a system of sounds. So when we are using language, we are actually moving from one signifier to the other. And we'll find that meaning changes when the context is further relieved. In a sense, language tends to develop into clauses, subclauses, and so on. And in that sense, meaning is constantly in a state of being altered. And Derrida mentions that there might be comic effects, in a sense, old traces versus the newly defined meanings. In a sense, a word or a situation which meant something in the past would mean something entirely different today. So the traces of old meanings are both present and absent. So in the sense, if we look at the history of language, of the English language, you would find that it carries traces of